My name is Everett Colton. I was working the night shift at Sacramento's main water treatment facility when the first infected broke through our security gate. Over the next 48 hours, I watched society collapse as the zombie outbreak spread like wildfire. I'm about to share how my engineering knowledge kept me alive when millions died. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. Before I became a survivor, I was just a water engineer. Everett Colton, Senior Systems Engineer at the Sacramento Municipal Water Treatment Plant. For 7 years, I made sure 500,000 people had clean, safe water without giving it a second thought. Funny how we take the most essential things for granted until they're gone. My job involved monitoring filtration systems, managing chemical treatments, and ensuring water quality met EPA standards. Not exactly the kind of work that prepares you for the apocalypse. Or so I thought. Turns out understanding how water infrastructure works became the difference between life and death when everything fell apart. I should mention that in the months before the outbreak, I've been working on a side project. A portable water filtration system that could purify contaminated water using commonly available materials. My colleagues thought I was wasting my time. "We already have water filters, Everett," they'd say. If only they knew how crucial that project would become. The week before everything happened, we'd received some unusual water quality reports from the northeastern suburbs. Nothing alarming, just slight anomalies in bacterial counts and fade levels. We attributed it to seasonal changes and scheduled additional testing. Standard procedure. I wish we'd looked closer. The signs were there, hidden in the data. Let me describe the Sacramento Water Treatment Plant so you understand what I was dealing with. It's a massive facility located on the American River, processing over 150 million gallons daily. 5 main buildings spread across 12 acres, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Security checkpoints, electronically locked doors, backup generators, all designed to keep the water flowing even in emergencies. Nobody anticipated the kind of emergency that was coming. The night shift at the plant was always skeletal, just enough people to monitor operations and handle any issues that might arise. That night, September 15th, 2023, there were 4 of us. Me in the control room, Jenkins handling operations in the East Wing, Thomas supervising maintenance, and Pete, our security guard who patrolled the perimeter hourly. There was something off about that evening. A tension in the air I couldn't explain. The control room monitors showed normal operations, but I kept feeling like something wasn't right. Earlier that day, local news had mentioned an incident at Sacramento Memorial Hospital. Some kind of disturbance in the emergency room. Nothing serious, they said. Just another day in a busy city hospital. We paid it no attention. Around 7 that evening, I noticed an uptick in calls from residents complaining about water pressure and strange odors from their taps. Not unusual during maintenance periods, but we weren't doing any scheduled work. I made a note to investigate in the morning and continued my rounds. At 9:30, the first emergency broadcast interrupted regular programming on the break room television. A somber-faced reporter mentioned multiple violent incidents across the downtown area. Police were advising people to stay indoors. Thomas joked about full moons bringing out the crazies. We all laughed. God, how naive we were. By 10 o'clock, the automated monitoring systems started flagging anomalies in the water quality from several distribution points. Again, nothing critical, just readings slightly outside normal parameters. I dispatched Jenkins to check the primary testing stations manually. Standard protocol when the automated systems act up. The control room windows gave me a clear view of the main gate and parking lot. Throughout the evening, I noticed increased activity on the road outside. More cars than usual, many speeding. Some headed toward downtown, others fleeing in the opposite direction. The city was growing restless. At 10:45, the emergency broadcasts became more frequent and urgent. Reports of extreme violence and unprecedented attacks in multiple locations. Hospitals overwhelmed. First responders unable to contain the situation. The reporter maintained composure, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. That's when I first felt that cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. We tried calling the Emergency Coordination Center as per protocol during civil disturbances, but the lines were jammed. All we got was a recorded message advising us to shelter in place and await further instructions. Thomas suggested implementing lockdown procedures as a precaution. I agreed. Pete was due back from his perimeter check at 11. When he still hadn't returned by 11:30, I tried raising him on the radio. No response. Thomas volunteered to look for him, but I said we should wait a bit longer. Another decision I replay in my mind constantly. At 11:47, I remember checking my watch. Pete finally appeared on the security camera, staggering across the parking lot toward the main entrance. Something was wrong. His uniform was torn, his movements uncoordinated. Thomas and I rushed to the entrance, thinking he might be injured. The moment we opened the door, Pete collapsed into the lobby, clutching his right arm. Blood seeped through his fingers from what looked like a bite wound, ragged and deep. His uniform was not just torn but spattered with blood, some of it definitely not his own. "People," he gasped. "People in the parking lot. They're attacking each other. One of them bit me. Wouldn't stop. Had to fight him off." We got Pete to the break room and administered first aid. The bite looked awful, like nothing I'd seen before. The edges were inflamed, with strange discoloration spreading outward from the wound. While Thomas bandaged him up, I checked the security monitors. The parking lot appeared empty now, but the main gate was ajar. Pete must have left it open in his rush to get inside. "We need to secure that gate," I said. Jenkins volunteered, but Pete grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there," Pete warned, his voice raspy. "They look normal until they don't. Then they just attack. No warning, no reason." We decided to remotely close the gate from the security office instead. I tried calling emergency services again to report Pete's injury, but still couldn't get through. The local news had given way to national coverage now. Similar incidents were being reported in cities across the country. The term mass hysteria was being used, along with speculation about contaminated drugs or some new street drug causing psychotic episodes. Pete's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next hour. His fever spiked to 103 degrees. The wound on his arm turned an alarming shade of purple-black, with visible veins of discoloration spreading up toward his shoulder. He alternated between shivering violently and sweating profusely. We gave him water and Tylenol from the first aid kit, but it did nothing to help. During one lucid moment, Pete looked directly at me and said something I'll never forget. "Something's in the water, Everett. I can feel it moving inside me." Then he started convulsing. We moved Pete to the staff lounge couch and took turns monitoring him while continuing to check security feeds and facility systems. The broadcasts were becoming increasingly chaotic. Reports of hospitals being overrun, police overwhelmed, military deployments in major cities. The governor declared a state of emergency at 1 a.m. By then, Pete was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently, his skin gray, and covered in a sheen of sweat. Throughout this time, the water quality alerts continued to ping from various distribution points. Nothing catastrophic, but the pattern was troubling, like whatever was causing the anomalies was spreading through the system. I silenced the non-critical alarms to focus on monitoring Pete and the security situation. Thomas suggested we might need to implement emergency purge protocols if the water quality continued to degrade, but that would mean cutting off supply to thousands of homes, an extreme measure we'd never had to use before. I told him we'd wait for proper authorization from the Department of Public Utilities. At 3:12 in the morning, Pete stopped breathing. Jenkins checked his pulse, shook his head, and covered Pete's face with a jacket. We stood there in silence, the weight of what was happening finally sinking in. Thomas said we should move the body to the storage room until emergency services could reach us. Jenkins and I agreed. As Jenkins leaned down to lift Pete's shoulders, the jacket slid away from Pete's face. His eyes were open, not just open, alert and focused, but completely wrong. The irises had expanded until almost no white was visible, and they turned a milky, clouded gray. Before Jenkins could react, Pete's hand shot up and grabbed his wrist. "He's alive," Jenkins exclaimed, relief in his voice. That relief turned to screaming when Pete lunged upward and sank his teeth into Jenkins' throat. Everything happened so fast after that. Blood sprayed across the room as Jenkins fell backward, clutching his neck. Pete, or what used to be Pete, rolled off the couch and onto the floor, then began crawling toward Thomas and me with unnatural, jerky movements. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Thomas' arm and pulling him toward the door. We sprinted down the corridor toward the control room, the sounds of Jenkins' gurgling screams following us until they suddenly stopped. We reached the control room, slammed the heavy security doors shut, and engaged the emergency locks. The room was designed to be secure, reinforced walls, controlled access, separate ventilation system. A safe haven in case of chemical leaks or security breaches. Now it was our only protection against whatever Pete had become. Thomas collapsed into a chair, hyperventilating. I moved to the security monitors, cycling through cameras to see what was happening in the break room. The feed showed Pete hunched over Jenkins' motionless body, doing things I still have nightmares about. Not eating exactly, but something worse, like he was trying to spread whatever had infected him. What the hell is happening? Thomas whispered, his face pale with shock. I had no answer. All I knew was that Pete had died, then come back as something else. Something violent and mindless. The emergency broadcast had mentioned attacks, but nothing about the dead coming back. We watched in horror as Pete finished with Jenkins and began shambling around the room, bumping into furniture, seemingly drawn to any noise or movement. The behavior was nothing like the Pete we knew, just a husk moving on some base instinct. This can't be real, Thomas kept saying. People don't just die and come back like that. But the evidence was right in front of us. About 20 minutes later, Jenkins started moving too. His motions were similar to Pete's, uncoordinated but purposeful in a primitive way. The two of them began pounding on the break room door, then wandering the corridors, clearly searching for something. For us. As dawn approached, I switched to external cameras. What I saw made my blood run cold. The parking lot, which had been mostly empty earlier, now contained at least 30 people, if you could still call them people. They moved the same way Pete did, aimless until something caught their attention, then fixated and aggressive. Some wore ordinary clothes, others hospital gowns or uniforms. Many were injured, bloody. All moved with that same unnatural gait. They were gathering around our facility, pressing against the fences, rattling the gates. A few had already breached the perimeter where Pete had left the gate ajar and were now wandering the grounds. The morning light revealed something else too. The city was in chaos. Distant plumes of smoke rose from downtown. Occasional gunshots echoed across the river. Emergency vehicle sirens wailed continuously, then gradually became less frequent as the morning progressed. We kept the news broadcast running on one monitor. The anchors tried to maintain composure, but their reporting became increasingly fragmented. Terms like infectious agent and unprecedented pandemic gave way to more direct language. The infected appeared to die and reanimate. Finally, reluctantly, one reporter used the word everyone had been avoiding: zombies. The power grid failed at around 9 in the morning. The sudden silence as air handlers and equipment shut down was jarring. A few seconds later, the backup generators kicked in with a low rumble, bringing essential systems back online. Emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie glow. Thomas was the first to voice what I'd been thinking. The water treatment processes need to keep running. He was right. This facility provided clean water for over 500,000 people in the Sacramento area. If it failed completely, even those who escaped infection would face dehydration within days, especially in the September heat. The generators have enough fuel for about 48 hours at full capacity, I explained. Maybe longer if we shut down non-essential systems. As we discussed our options, I checked the automated water quality monitoring. The results were disturbing. Whatever anomalies we detected earlier had multiplied. Microscopic organisms that shouldn't be there were showing up in samples throughout the system. Nothing our standard tests could identify, but definitely foreign to our normal water profile. Could it be connected? Thomas asked, pointing to the screens showing Pete and Jenkins wandering the corridors. Could something in the water be causing this? The thought had occurred to me too. Pete's last coherent words, "Something's in the water," took on new significance. If the infection was waterborne, the implications were catastrophic. We need to adjust the treatment protocols, I said. Increase chlorination levels, activate the UV purification arrays, implement filtration stage 4. Thomas nodded and started inputting commands into the system. We were flying blind, with no idea if our standard purification methods would be effective against whatever this was, but we had to try. As morning turned to afternoon, we watched the situation deteriorate, both inside and outside the facility. More infected, I couldn't think of them as people anymore, gathered around the perimeter. The security feeds showed them pounding on doors, breaking windows in the administrative building. It was only a matter of time before they found their way into the main treatment areas. The news broadcast became sporadic, then stopped altogether. The emergency broadcast system continued for a while longer. Clinical instructions to remain indoors, avoid contact with infected individuals, wait for military evacuation. Then it too went silent. We were completely cut off, with no idea how widespread the situation had become or if any organized response was underway. All we knew was that we were alone in a critical infrastructure facility, surrounded by the infected, with limited time before the generators failed. Throughout the morning, we watched Pete and Jenkins through the security cameras. Their movements became more erratic as time passed, but followed a disturbing pattern. They would wander aimlessly until a sound caught their attention, then fixate and move toward it with single-minded determination. They no longer resembled our colleagues in any meaningful way. Just empty shells driven by some primitive instinct. Thomas couldn't stop watching them. They're dead, right? I mean, Pete definitely died. We both saw it. But they're still moving. I had no scientific explanation. Everything I knew about biology, about life and death, provided no framework for what we were witnessing. Pete had stopped breathing. His heart had stopped beating. By any medical definition, he had died. And yet there he was, moving through the facility with Jenkins, who had suffered injuries no one could survive. I remember zombie movies, I told Thomas, but this is real. This is actually happening. While Pete's transformation had taken hours, Jenkins turned much faster. The bite seemed to accelerate the process somehow. Within an hour of being attacked, he was indistinguishable from Pete in behavior. Both retained basic motor functions but showed no signs of higher cognition. They couldn't operate doors with keypads or navigate to specific locations. They just reacted, moving towards stimuli in their environment. As daylight strengthened, I switched between external camera feeds to assess our situation. The view was apocalyptic. From our elevated position, we could see portions of the city across the river. Several buildings were burning, sending thick columns of smoke into the morning sky. Traffic on the main roads had stopped entirely, with abandoned and crashed vehicles blocking intersections. Some areas appeared to be in complete darkness despite the daylight. The power outages were widespread. Most disturbing was the movement visible throughout the city. From this distance, individuals were just tiny figures, but their movements were distinctive. That same shambling gait we'd observed in Pete and Jenkins. Thousands of them, flowing through streets like a grotesque parody of normal city activity. Around the treatment plant, their numbers continued to grow. The chain-link fence was bending inward in several places from the pressure of bodies pressed against it. At the main gate, which Pete had left partially open, a steady stream of infected were finding their way onto the grounds. They seemed drawn to the facility somehow, congregating around entrances and windows. Why are they all coming here? Thomas wondered aloud. Sound, maybe. The generators are loud, or they're just following others. But I wasn't convinced of my own explanation. Their behavior seemed too directed, too purposeful. Especially troubling was how they gathered near water outlets and testing stations around the exterior of the building, almost as if they were drawn to the water itself. We monitored the news broadcasts until they went dark one by one. The final reports confirmed what we were seeing, a nationwide outbreak of unknown origin causing death followed by reanimation. Bite transmission was mentioned, but some reporters speculated about additional vectors, airborne, waterborne, or direct fluid contact. The uncertainty only added to the fear. The last coherent broadcast included footage from military checkpoints being established around Sacramento. The state fairgrounds was being converted into an emergency safe zone, with medical screening and refugee processing. The reporter mentioned that the military was prioritizing critical infrastructure personnel, power plant workers, medical staff, and water treatment engineers. That's us, Thomas said when he heard that. We need to find a way to reach that safe zone. But the footage showed the fairgrounds were on the other side of the city, at least 10 miles from our location. With the streets full of infected, it might as well have been 1,000 miles away. When the city power failed, the transition to generator power was automatic. The facility had been designed to operate off-grid if necessary. But our fuel reserves were finite, and without regular deliveries, we'd eventually go dark. I accessed the generator control systems to check our status. 42 hours at current consumption, I reported to Thomas. Less if we keep all systems running. That's when the hard decisions began. Which treatment processes were absolutely essential? Which could we shut down to conserve fuel? Every choice had consequences for water quality and supply. We systematically reduced power to non-critical systems, administrative areas, secondary pumping stations, half of the exterior lighting. We diverted all available resources to the core treatment processes: sedimentation, filtration, disinfection. The water quality monitors continued to show anomalies throughout the system. Whatever was in the water wasn't being fully removed by our standard treatment processes. I increased chlorination to maximum allowable levels and activated all UV purification arrays, hoping to neutralize any biological contaminants. But without knowing exactly what we were dealing with, it was like shooting in the dark. Around midday, we noticed a change in Pete and Jenkins's behavior. They began congregating near the main treatment tanks, pressing their faces against the observation windows, dipping their hands into sample collection points when they could access them. It wasn't random movement anymore. They were seeking out water. Something's definitely drawing them to the water, Thomas observed. Maybe the infection originated there. The idea was terrifying, but made a certain sense. Water connected everyone. If something had contaminated the municipal supply, it could explain the rapid spread. But then, why weren't we infected? We've been drinking the facility water all night. Let's check the treatment logs from the past week, I suggested. Look for anything unusual in the incoming river water. We dug through the data, and what we found was subtle but concerning. Beginning approximately 10 days earlier, routine testing had detected slightly elevated microorganism levels in the river intake. Nothing that exceeded safety parameters, but a definite shift from historical norms. The automated systems had increased chlorination in response, bringing the readings back within acceptable ranges. No alarms were triggered, no manual intervention required. We would never have noticed this during normal operations, I realized. The system compensated automatically, but something had slipped through. Something our tests couldn't identify and our treatments couldn't completely eliminate. What if the standard disinfection protocols were ineffective against whatever this was? The implications were staggering. As we processed this information, a new problem emerged. The infected outside had breached one of the administrative building entrances. Security cameras showed them pouring into the lower offices, spreading throughout that wing of the facility. The only thing separating them from the main treatment areas, and us, were two sets of security doors that required keycard access. How long will those doors hold? Thomas asked, the fear evident in his voice. They're designed to withstand forced entry, but with enough pressure. I didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew that as more infected gathered, the doors would eventually fail. We needed a plan. The control room was secure for now, with reinforced walls and an independent ventilation system. We had water, some emergency rations, and access to critical systems. But we couldn't stay there indefinitely. The generators needed refueling, and eventually, we would need to find a way to the military safe zone. We need to reach the generator room, I said. Check the actual fuel levels and see if we can extend our power supply. Thomas pulled up the facility schematics on one of the monitors. The generator room was in the basement level of the main building, 3 floors down and across the facility from our current position. To reach it, we need to navigate through corridors that might already be compromised. We need supplies first, Thomas pointed out, and something to defend ourselves. He was right. The control room contained nothing that could serve as an effective weapon. We need to make a stop at the maintenance area, where tools were stored, before attempting to reach the generators. We spent the next hour formulating a plan. Using the security cameras, we mapped the infected's movements throughout the facility, identifying the areas of highest concentration and potential safe passages. Pete and Jenkins remained near the water treatment tanks, along with several other infected who had found their way inside. Their behavior continued to revolve around water sources, confirming our suspicions about the nature of the infection. If the infection is waterborne, I theorized, then the first infected wouldn't have been biters. They would have been people who consumed contaminated water. The biting came later as a secondary transmission vector. But why? Thomas asked. What kind of pathogen changes behavior like that? I don't know. But if water is the primary vector, that would explain why they're drawn to water sources now. Whatever's controlling them is seeking to spread through the water supply. The thought that some microorganism could influence human behavior so dramatically, transforming people into vectors for its own transmission, was beyond disturbing. It violated everything I understood about biology and disease. But the evidence was compelling. Pete's final words, "Something's in the water," took on new significance. With our plan in place, we prepared to leave the control room's safety. I found a small duffel bag in a storage cabinet and filled it with essential items: water quality testing equipment, facility maps, K-cards, a flashlight, and Pete's radio. Thomas located the emergency first aid kit and added it to our supplies. What about weapons? Thomas asked. The control room contained nothing suitable. We need to improvise once we reach the maintenance area. Ready? I asked, hand poised over the door release. Thomas nodded, though fear was etched across his face. I couldn't blame him. I was terrified too. But we couldn't stay in the control room forever. Our generator fuel was limited, and we needed to find a way to reach the military safe zone before the facility was completely overrun. I pressed the button, and the security door slid open with a soft hiss. The corridor beyond was dimly lit by emergency lighting, creating pools of light amid deep shadows. We listened intently, but heard nothing except the distant hum of the generators. "Clear," I whispered, stepping into the hallway. Thomas followed, and I sealed the control room behind us. That was our safe haven gone. The door would automatically lock, and we didn't have the clearance to reopen it once it closed. We moved cautiously down the corridor, following our planned route toward the maintenance area. The emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie blue glow, transforming the once familiar facility into something alien and threatening. Every shadow might conceal an infected. Every distant sound caused us to freeze in our tracks. Our first encounter came at the junction leading to the eastern wing. An infected staff member, I recognized her as Monica from accounting, was standing motionless in the center of the hallway. Her clothing was soaked, as if she'd been standing under running water, and her skin had a gray, waterlogged appearance. She wasn't moving, but her head was cocked slightly, as if listening. "Back up slowly," I whispered to Thomas. "There's another way around." We retreated carefully, but Thomas's foot caught on a fallen trash can, sending it clattering across the floor. Monica's head snapped toward us, her clouded eyes fixing on our position. She opened her mouth, but instead of a scream or growl, water dribbled down her chin. Then she charged. Her movements were faster than Pete's or Jenkins's had been, more coordinated, more deliberate. We ran back the way we'd come, taking the first side passage we found. Monica followed, but her wet shoes slipped on the polished floor, sending her crashing into a wall. We didn't wait to see if she recovered. We just kept running. The encounter forced us to deviate from our planned route. Instead of approaching the maintenance area from the main corridor, we had to wind through the laboratory section, a maze of small rooms filled with water testing equipment. The labs were dark, with only minimal emergency lighting, making navigation treacherous. In one of the testing labs, we found Jenkins hunched over a water sample station. He was doing something bizarre, repeatedly dipping his hands into a collection basin, then pressing his wet palms against his face, as if trying to absorb the water through his skin. The sight was so unnatural, so wrong, that we froze momentarily in shock. Jenkins sensed our presence. He turned slowly, water dripping from his face and hands. His eyes had developed that same clouded appearance as Pete's and Monica's, but worse. Thin, dark filaments were visible in the whites, like tiny worms writhing beneath the surface. When he opened his mouth, more water spilled out, but it wasn't clear like the basin water. It was darkly tinted, almost black. "Run," I urged Thomas, pulling him toward the lab's rear exit. Jenkins lurched after us, moving with that same unnerving coordination Monica had displayed. These infected weren't shambling zombies from movies. They were becoming more coordinated, more purposeful in their movements. Evolving before our eyes, we managed to lose Jenkins in the warren of laboratory rooms, finally emerging near the facility's maintenance area. The door was locked, but my keycard granted access. We slipped inside and secured the door behind us. The maintenance area was a large workshop filled with tools, spare parts, and equipment used for facility repairs. Workbenches lined the walls, while larger machinery occupied the center space. Everything from basic hand tools to specialized water system components was stored here. "We need weapons," Thomas said, scanning the room, "and something to carry them in." We quickly gathered what we could. I found a heavy pipe wrench that could serve as a bludgeoning tool. Thomas located a fire axe in an emergency cabinet. We added several screwdrivers, a hammer, and a crowbar to our collection, distributing them between us and the duffel bag. "What's the plan now?" Thomas asked as we finished gathering supplies. "Generator room first," I replied. "We need to check the actual fuel levels and see if there's any way to extend our power supply." According to the facility schematics, we could reach the basement level through a maintenance stairwell located at the back of the workshop. It would allow us to bypass the main corridors where most of the infected seemed to be congregating. Before leaving the maintenance area, I had another thought. My water filtration prototype, the one my colleagues had laughed at, was stored in a locker here. If the infection was waterborne, having portable filtration capability might prove crucial. I located the locker and retrieved the prototype. A compact system using activated carbon, ceramic, and advanced membrane filtration, all housed in a unit the size of a large water bottle. "What's that?" Thomas asked. "Insurance," I replied, adding it to our supplies. The maintenance stairwell was narrow and poorly lit, descending 3 levels to the facility's basement. We moved cautiously, listening for any sounds that might indicate infected were present. The stairwell remained clear, but as we approached the basement level, we could hear something, a rhythmic thumping, like multiple fists pounding on metal. The sound grew louder as we reached the basement door. I pressed my ear against it, trying to determine what was happening on the other side. The pounding continued, accompanied by what sounded like running water. "They're in there," I whispered to Thomas. "Near the generator room." "How many?" "Can't tell. But it doesn't sound good." We had no choice but to proceed. The generator room was our primary objective, and without checking the fuel reserves, we couldn't formulate a long-term survival plan. I gripped the pipe wrench in one hand, keycard in the other, and nodded to Thomas, who readied his fire axe. I swept the card, and the door unlocked with an audible click. Pushing it open slowly, we peered into the basement corridor. The scene was worse than I'd anticipated. The basement was partially flooded, with several inches of water covering the floor. A burst pipe somewhere was spraying water from the ceiling, adding to the accumulation, and in this shallow pool, at least a dozen infected were gathered outside the generator room door, pounding on it ceaselessly. They were all in various states of decay, their skin showing that same waterlogged appearance we'd observed in Monica. They turned as one when our door opened, water dripping from their mouths and eyes. The nearest began moving toward us immediately. "Back up," I told Thomas. "We need another way in." We retreated into the stairwell, closing the door quickly. The infected began pounding on it almost immediately, but the security lock held firm. "There's another approach through the water intake tunnels," I explained, consulting the facility schematics in my mind. "We can access the tunnels from the primary filtration area and circle around to the generator room from below. It would be a longer route, potentially more dangerous, but it was our only option now that the direct approach was blocked. The primary filtration area is on the other side of the building," Thomas pointed out. "We'd have to cross through the main treatment space, which is probably crawling with infected by now." He was right, but we had few alternatives. Without checking the generators, we couldn't know how much time we had left before the facility went completely dark. "We'll move carefully," I said. "Use the catwalks above the treatment tanks. The infected seem to be congregating at water level. If we stay elevated, we might avoid detection." Thomas nodded reluctantly. We climbed back up to the ground floor and made our way toward the main treatment area, using service corridors to avoid the more populated sections of the facility. The main treatment space was the heart of the water plant, a vast cathedral-like area housing enormous sedimentation basins, filtration tanks, and chemical treatment systems. Catwalks and maintenance platforms spanned the space at various levels, allowing access to equipment and monitoring points. Under normal circumstances, the area would be humming with machinery and brightly lit. Now, with power restricted to essential systems, much of it lay in shadow, with only the primary treatment processes still operational. We accessed the treatment area through a maintenance door and immediately understood why the infected were drawn here. Dozens of them were gathered around the water basins and treatment tanks, dipping their hands and faces into the water whenever they could access it. Some were even attempting to climb into the larger basins, though most lacked the coordination to manage it. Their behavior was uniform and disturbing. They weren't drinking the water, but seemed to be trying to immerse themselves in it. Those who succeeded in reaching the water emerged changed, moving with greater coordination and purpose than the others. The water was transforming them somehow, strengthening whatever had taken control of their bodies. "We need to move quietly," I whispered to Thomas. "Stay on the upper catwalks and avoid making any noise." We began our crossing, stepping carefully on the metal walkways that spanned the treatment area. From our elevated position, we had a clear view of the infected below, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears. The infection wasn't just waterborne, it was evolving, adapting its host to better spread through water systems. The infected weren't mindless. They were being directed by whatever had taken over their bodies, serving as vectors for its transmission. Halfway across the treatment area, disaster struck. The catwalk we were traversing had been damaged somehow, leaving a section dangerously unstable. As Thomas stepped onto it, the metal groaned loudly, the sound echoing throughout the chamber. Below us, dozens of clouded eyes turned upward in unison. "Run," I said, abandoning stealth. "Get to the other side." We sprinted across the remaining catwalk, the metal swaying alarmingly beneath our weight. Behind us, the infected began converging on the catwalk access points, climbing with that same unnerving coordination we'd observed in the more water-exposed specimens. We reached the far side of the treatment area, just as the first infected gained the catwalk behind us. I swiped my keycard on the security door, practically falling through as it opened. Thomas followed, and I slammed the door shut as hands reached for us. The security lock engaged automatically, sealing the infected on the other side. We found ourselves in the primary filtration control area, a smaller room housing the controls and monitoring equipment for the initial water treatment stages. From here, we could access the water intake tunnels that led to the generator room. That was too close, Thomas gasped, leaning against a wall to catch his breath. They're getting smarter, I observed. Or whatever's controlling them is learning how to use them more effectively. The implications were chilling. If the infection could adapt this quickly, improving its host capabilities to better spread through water systems, we were facing something far more dangerous than mindless zombies. We were dealing with an intelligent pathogen that understood the infrastructure it was trying to infiltrate. I located the access hatch leading to the water intake tunnels, a circular metal door set into the floor designed for maintenance access. Using tools from our collection, we managed to unseal and open it. Below, a ladder descended into darkness, leading to the concrete tunnels that channeled river water into the treatment facility. I'll go first, I said, taking the flashlight from our supplies. Follow when I signal it's clear. I descended the ladder into the water intake tunnel, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air grew cooler and damper with each step, carrying the mineral smell of river water. When I reached the bottom, I swept the light around to assess our surroundings. The intake tunnel was a massive concrete tube, about 15 feet in diameter, with a shallow stream of water flowing along the bottom. Under normal operations, this tunnel would be nearly full, channeling river water into the treatment facility. But with power restrictions limiting intake volume, only a fraction of the usual flow was present. It created an eerie effect. Our footsteps and voices echoed off the curved walls, amplified by the hollow space. All clear, I called up to Thomas. Watch your step on the ladder. It's slippery. While waiting for Thomas to descend, I examined the water flowing through the tunnel. Even in the flashlight beam, I could see it wasn't normal. Tiny dark particles suspended in the current caught the light, moving in ways that seemed almost purposeful rather than following the water's flow. When I directed the beam at one section for too long, the particles appeared to scatter, avoiding the light. No natural sediment behaves that way. What are you looking at? Thomas asked, joining me at the bottom of the ladder. Something in the water. Watch. I demonstrated the effect with the flashlight. Thomas' expression grew troubled as he observed the particles reacting to the light. What is that? Some kind of algae? I don't think so. Algae doesn't avoid light. It's usually drawn to it. Whatever these particles were, they appeared to be concentrated in the intake. Water and our treatment processes weren't completely removing them. If they were connected to the infection, it explained how it had spread so rapidly through the municipal water supply. According to the facility schematics, the intake tunnel branched about a quarter-mile ahead, with one passage continuing to the treatment plant and another providing maintenance access to the generator room. We needed to follow the tunnel until we reached that junction. Stay out of the water as much as possible, I advised Thomas. Use the maintenance walkway along the side. We began making our way down the tunnel, keeping to the narrow concrete walkway that ran along the wall. The footing was treacherous. Years of moisture had left the surface slick with algae and mineral deposits. Our progress was slow, each step taken with caution. The tunnel felt oppressive, with the constant sound of flowing water and the knowledge of thousands of tons of earth and concrete above us. The flashlight created shifting shadows that played tricks on our eyes, making us jump at nothing. And always there was the unsettling awareness of those strange particles in the water beside us, occasionally catching the light in unnatural ways. Everett, Thomas whispered after we'd gone about 200 yards. I think there's something in the water. I followed his gaze and saw what had alarmed him. Amid the dark particles, something larger was moving upstream against the current. Not swimming exactly, but undulating through the water with deliberate motion. It reminded me of time-lapse footage I'd seen of slime molds growing, a network of filaments extending and contracting to propel the organism forward. Don't shine the light directly on it, I cautioned, remembering how the particles had scattered when illuminated. Just keep moving. We quickened our pace as much as the slippery walkway allowed. Behind us, I could hear splashing sounds that didn't match the normal flow of the water. Something was following us, tracking our movement through the tunnel. The junction appeared ahead, marked by a large valve mechanism and directional signage. The maintenance access to the generator room branched off to the right, through a smaller tunnel with a sealed pressure door. I hurried toward it, keycard already in hand. Before we reached the junction, a sound from behind made us both turn. The splashing had grown louder, more deliberate. In the indirect beam of the flashlight, I caught glimpses of something emerging from the water at the center of the tunnel, a humanoid figure, but wrong in every way. Water streamed from its form, but it didn't appear solid like a normal body. Instead, it seemed composed of the same dark filaments we'd observed in the water, temporarily holding a human shape. "Move," I urged Thomas, no longer concerned with stealth. "Get to the pressure door." We ran the remaining distance to the junction, the splashing behind us accelerating into the sound of something rushing through water. I reached the pressure door first, swiping my keycard through the reader. The mechanism clicked, and I spun the manual wheel to unlock the seal. Thomas helped me pull the heavy door open just as the splashing reached the junction. We tumbled through the doorway and heaved the pressure door shut, spinning the wheel to reseal it. Something impacted the other side immediately. Not the mindless pounding of the infected we'd encountered earlier, but deliberate manipulation of the wheel mechanism. Whatever was pursuing us possessed enough intelligence to understand how the door functioned. "It's trying to open it," Thomas said in horror. The wheel on our side began to turn slowly in the opposite direction, fighting against our earlier tightening. I jammed the crowbar from our tool collection through the spokes of the wheel, preventing further movement. The metal groaned as pressure was applied from the other side, but the improvised lock held. "That won't stop it forever," I warned. "We need to move quickly." The maintenance tunnel leading to the generator room was narrower than the main intake, barely 7 feet in diameter. A dry concrete floor made walking easier, but the confined space heightened our sense of being trapped. The sound of something continuing to work at the pressure door mechanism followed us down the tunnel, growing fainter as we increased our distance. "What was that thing back there?" Thomas asked as we hurried forward. "It wasn't like the others." "I think it's what they're becoming," I replied. "The water is changing them, breaking them down and rebuilding them into something else. The more exposed they are to the infected water, the more they transform." The tunnel ended at an access shaft with a ladder leading upward. According to the schematics, this would bring us into a maintenance closet adjacent to the generator room. If our navigation was correct, we'd bypass the infected gathered outside the main entrance. I climbed the ladder, first pushing open the hatch at the top. As expected, we emerged in a small maintenance closet filled with cleaning supplies and electrical equipment. The generator's sound was much louder here, a constant rumble that vibrated through the floor and walls. "We made it," I told Thomas as he joined me in the closet. The door to the generator room would normally be unlocked, but the emergency protocols might have sealed it. I tried the handle cautiously, relieved when it turned freely. Opening the door a crack, I peered into the generator room to ensure it was clear before proceeding. The generator room was a large industrial space housing the facility's 3 diesel generators, massive machines capable of powering the entire plant when necessary. Under current conservation measures, only one was running at full capacity, creating enough power for essential systems. The other 2 were idle, saved for emergency rotation. I immediately moved to the monitoring station, checking the fuel gauges and system readouts. The news wasn't good. The active generator had consumed fuel faster than the automated system had calculated, likely due to power fluctuations caused by the unstable grid before it failed completely. We had less than 30 hours remaining at current consumption rates. "It's worse than we thought," I told Thomas. "We need to conserve even more power or find a way to refuel." The facility maintained a fuel reserve in underground tanks adjacent to the generator room, but accessing those would require the pumping system, which itself consumed power. It was a calculated risk. Use some fuel now to access the reserves, potentially extending our total supply significantly. While I assessed the fuel situation, Thomas checked the structural integrity of the generator room. The pounding we'd heard from the stairwell was audible here too, coming from the main entrance. The reinforced door was holding for now, but sustained assault would eventually compromise it. "How long will that door last?" I asked, nodding toward the main entrance. "Hard to say. It's steel core designed for security, but they've been at it for hours already. The hinges will likely fail first." We needed to make decisions quickly. 30 hours wasn't enough time to formulate a comprehensive survival plan or find a safe route to the military evacuation point. But if we could access the reserve fuel, we might buy enough time to develop a better strategy. "I'm going to initiate the fuel transfer," I decided. "It will make noise and use some power, but if it works, we'll gain several days of operation." The transfer process required accessing the pump controls on the far side of the generator room. As I made my way across the space, I noticed something disturbing. Small puddles had formed on the floor near the wall adjacent to the basement corridor, where the infected were gathered. Water was seeping through minute cracks in the concrete, forming tiny rivulets that converged and grew larger as they crossed the floor. And in that water, I could see the same dark particles we'd observed in the intake tunnel. "Thomas," I called, pointing to the water. "They're getting in." The implication was clear. The infected weren't just mindlessly pounding on the door. They were systematically introducing water into the room. Water containing whatever organism was causing the infection. Given enough time, they wouldn't need to break down the door. The pathogen would simply flow in under it. "We need to move faster," Thomas urged, eyeing the spreading puddles warily. I reached the pump controls and initiated the fuel transfer sequence. The system rumbled to life, adding to the generator noise. On the monitoring display, I could see fuel levels in the reserve tanks, enough to power the facility for another week if we could successfully transfer it to the generator tanks. The transfer would take approximately 20 minutes to complete. During that time, we were committed to remaining in the generator room, despite the water slowly seeping in from the corridor. Thomas found some absorbent material in a spill containment kit and began creating barriers to slow the water spread, but it was a temporary measure at best. While waiting for the fuel transfer, I collected samples of the water and dark particles in empty containers from my bag. If we reached the military safe zone, this evidence might help scientists understand what we were dealing with. I also took the opportunity to examine the particles more closely using a small magnifying lens from the water testing kit. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. The particles weren't simple microorganisms or algae. They were composed of intricate structures that resembled both mechanical components and biological cells, something engineered rather than naturally occurring. Under magnification, they moved with clear purpose, forming temporary connections with each other before breaking apart and reforming in new configurations. "This isn't natural," I told Thomas, passing him the magnifier. "Whatever this is, it was designed." "Designed? You mean like a bioweapon?" "I don't know. But natural pathogens don't behave this way. They don't coordinate their hosts' actions with this level of specificity. And they certainly don't rebuild their hosts into new forms like what we saw in the tunnel." The fuel transfer reached 50% completion when we heard a new sound from the main entrance, not pounding, but a high-pitched squeal of metal under stress. The hinges were beginning to fail. "We can't wait for the full transfer," I decided, checking the current levels. "We have enough to buy us another 36 hours. That'll have to do." I aborted the remaining transfer and shut down the pumping system. We needed to leave immediately, before the infected breached the generator room. But our exit options were limited. Returning through the water intake tunnel was too dangerous, especially knowing what was waiting for us there. The main entrance was about to be overrun. That left only one possibility: the ventilation system. The generator room, like all areas housing combustion equipment, had an extensive ventilation system to prevent carbon dioxide buildup. The main duct was large enough for a person to navigate, designed to allow maintenance access. It would be cramped and disorienting, but it might provide a path to a safer part of the facility. I located the access panel for the main ventilation duct high on the wall opposite the failing door. Using tools from our collection, Thomas and I worked quickly to remove the panel, revealing the dark tunnel beyond. "I'll go first," I offered, already climbing onto a workbench positioned beneath the opening. "Hand me the supplies and I'm in." The duct was even tighter than I'd anticipated, barely wide enough for my shoulders. I pulled myself forward on my elbows, the metal cold and unyielding against my body. Thomas passed the supply bag and tools up to me, then followed with considerable effort, his larger frame making the confined space even more challenging. We'd barely secured the access panel behind us when we heard the sound of the generator room door finally giving way. The infected had broken through. We lay motionless in the duct, barely daring to breathe as the sounds of movement filled the room below. Water splashed as more infected entered the space, drawn by the generator's noise and vibration. We began moving through the ventilation system, crawling on elbows and knees through the metal passages. The ductwork was a maze, branching in multiple directions to serve different parts of the facility. Using my memory of the building schematics, I led us toward what I hoped was a safer zone: the upper administrative offices, which had been largely abandoned when the outbreak began. Progress was agonizingly slow. The ducts weren't designed for human traversal despite their size, with sharp edges and unexpected drops that forced us to backtrack and find alternate routes. The flashlight provided limited visibility in the tight confines, and the beam attracted small flying insects that had made the ventilation system their home. After what felt like hours of painful crawling, we reached a section where the duct widened into a junction chamber. This provided enough space to sit up and rest briefly, a welcome relief for our scraped elbows and bruised knees. "Where are we heading?" Thomas whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the metal chamber. "The administrative wing," I replied. "It's furthest from the water treatment areas. Should have fewer infected." As we rested, I considered our next steps. We'd confirm the generator fuel situation, approximately 36 more hours before complete power loss. That wasn't enough time to reach the military safe zone on foot through infected-filled streets. We needed transportation, or at least a better understanding of conditions outside the facility. The roof, I realized suddenly. We need to get to the roof. From there, we can see the surrounding area, maybe spot evacuation points or clear routes. The administrative building had roof access through a maintenance stairwell. If we could reach that part of the facility, we might be able to get a better perspective on our situation. The ventilation system would take us close, but we'd eventually need to exit and traverse corridors to reach the roof access. After catching our breath, we continued through the duct system. The path gradually angled upward as we approached the administrative wing, requiring increasingly strenuous effort to make progress. Several times we encountered junctions with multiple possible routes, forcing me to make educated guesses based on my facility knowledge. One junction presented a particular challenge. As we approached, we could hear sounds coming from one of the branching ducts, the same unsettling wet noises we'd associated with the infected. Somehow, they had found their way into the ventilation system, perhaps attracted by the air movement or vibrations from our own passage. "We need to go another way," I whispered to Thomas. We backtracked to an earlier junction and took an alternate route, one that I believed would still lead toward the administrative wing, albeit through a more circuitous path. The new route was even more cramped, forcing us to remove our packs and push them ahead of us as we crawled. Finally, after what seemed an eternity of claustrophobic travel, we reached an exit grill that overlooked an office space. Through the metal slats, I could see desks, chairs, and computer equipment, the accounting department, if I recalled correctly. The space appeared empty of infected, though the emergency lighting cast deep shadows that might conceal threats. Using a screwdriver from our tools, I carefully removed the screws securing the grill. We lowered it gently to avoid making noise, then peered more thoroughly into the room below. It remained clear as far as we could see. I dropped through the opening first, landing as quietly as possible on a desk positioned beneath the vent. Thomas followed, his larger frame making considerably more noise as he squeezed through the opening and landed heavily. We both froze, listening for any reaction to the sound, but the office remained quiet. The accounting department was on the third floor of the administrative building. The roof access was one floor up, in a maintenance room at the end of the executive corridor. To reach it, we'd need to find a stairwell and navigate through potentially infected-filled hallways. We moved cautiously through the darkened office space, using the flashlight sparingly to avoid attracting attention. Most of the department showed signs of hasty evacuation, overturned chairs, personal items scattered on desks, a half-eaten breakfast abandoned when the alarm sounded. But no bodies and, importantly, no infected. "This area must have been successfully evacuated," Thomas whispered. It was a small piece of good news. Perhaps some of our colleagues had escaped before the facility was overrun. I chose to believe that rather than the alternative, that they had been infected and had wandered elsewhere in search of water. We located the department's exit, a door leading to the main third-floor corridor. Listening at the door revealed no sounds from beyond. I cracked it open slightly, peering into the hallway. The emergency lighting functioned here too, casting the corridor in that same eerie blue glow we'd encountered throughout the facility. As far as I could see in both directions, the hallway was clear. "The central stairwell should be to the left," I told Thomas, "about 50 yards down." We stepped into the corridor, moving as silently as possible. The administrative building was eerily quiet compared to the water treatment areas, with no infected immediately visible. But the silence itself was unsettling after hours of generator noise and rushing water. Every creak of the building, every whisper of air through vents, made us tense and ready to flee. Reaching the central stairwell, we found the door ajar, a trail of dried blood leading up the stairs. Someone had come this way during the initial outbreak, likely injured and seeking higher ground. We followed the blood trail cautiously, weapons ready. The trail led to the fourth floor and continued down the executive corridor toward the maintenance room with roof access. As we followed it, I noticed something disturbing about the blood pattern. It started as normal droplets and smears, indicating someone walking while bleeding. But further along it changed character, becoming more spread out, with strange, feathered patterns at the edges, as if the blood itself had been trying to move independently of the person carrying it. The blood trail ended at the maintenance room door, which stood partially open. From within, we could hear a faint rhythmic sound, like liquid dripping onto a hard surface. Thomas and I exchanged glances, both recognizing that investigating could be dangerous but necessary if we wanted roof access. I pushed the door open slowly with a pipe wrench, revealing the maintenance room beyond. The space was cluttered with cleaning equipment, electrical panels, and HVAC controls. In the center of the room, slumped against the base of a water heater, was the source of the blood trail, the facility's director, Robert Keller. Or rather, what remained of him. Keller's body had undergone a transformation, similar to what we'd observed in the more water-exposed infected, but more advanced. His skin had turned that same gray, waterlogged color, but with pronounced dark veining visible beneath the surface. His clothes were soaked, continuously dripping water onto the floor, the sound we'd heard from outside. Most disturbing was his face. The features were still recognizable as Keller's, but his eyes had become entirely black, with no distinction between iris and sclera, and the same dark filaments we'd seen in the water moved visibly beneath the surface. He wasn't moving, but I couldn't tell if he was truly inactive or simply waiting. Whatever stage of infection he represented, it was far beyond the mindless aggression of Pete and Jenkins. "The roof ladder is behind him," Thomas whispered, pointing to a metal ladder attached to the wall beyond Keller's position. We would need to get past him to reach the roof. I studied the room, looking for an alternate path or something we could use to distract him if he was still reactive. The maintenance room contained various chemicals and cleaning supplies that might prove useful. "I have an idea," I whispered to Thomas. "If these things are drawn to water, maybe we can use that." I located a container of concentrated cleaning fluid, a powerful alkaline solution used for descaling water equipment. In its concentrated form, it would cause a severe chemical reaction with water. Taking a smaller empty container from a shelf, I carefully poured some of the concentrated solution into it. "When I throw this, be ready to move quickly toward the ladder," I instructed Thomas. "If it works, it should draw his attention away from us." Thomas nodded, gripping his fire axe tightly. I took aim at the far corner of the room, as distant from the ladder as possible, and threw the container. It shattered against the wall, the cleaning solution immediately beginning to bubble and steam as it contacted the damp surface. The reaction was instantaneous. Keller's head snapped toward the sound and chemical reaction, his body unfolding from its slumped position with unnatural fluidity. He moved toward the spreading chemical spill, drawn by its interaction with water rather than by the noise as I'd expected. His movement revealed something else disturbing. He left a wet trail behind him, not just from dripping clothes, but as if his body itself was partially liquefied. While Keller was distracted by the chemical reaction, we seized our opportunity. Thomas went first, darting past the transformed director and beginning to climb the ladder. I followed closely behind, my eyes never leaving Keller as he interacted with the spreading chemicals. His behavior was nothing like the other infected we'd encountered. Instead of mindlessly touching the liquid, he appeared to be analyzing it, his head tilted in an almost contemplative posture. Just as I reached the ladder, Keller seemed to realize the deception. He turned with that same unnatural fluidity, his black eyes fixing on me. For a moment, I felt a foreign pressure in my mind, not quite a voice, but a sense of being examined by something utterly alien. Then he began moving toward the ladder with alarming speed. I scrambled up the rungs as quickly as possible, Thomas already at the top working to unlock the roof access hatch. I could hear Keller below, the wet sounds of his movement growing closer. The ladder vibrated as he began to climb after us. "Hurry," I urged Thomas, who was struggling with the rusted lock mechanism. With a final wrench of effort, Thomas broke the corroded lock and pushed the hatch open. Daylight flooded down the shaft. It was early afternoon by now, though it felt like we'd been fighting for survival for an eternity. We emerged onto the rooftop, immediately wrestling to close the hatch behind us. I spotted a piece of rebar among the roofing materials stored there and slid it through the hatch handle, effectively bearing it from below. The administrative building's roof was flat and graveled, surrounded by a 3-foot parapet wall. Various HVAC units and satellite dishes were positioned across the surface. From this 5-story vantage point, we had an unobstructed view of the surrounding area, and the full scope of the catastrophe became clear. Sacramento was dying. Plumes of smoke rose from dozens of locations across the city. The downtown area appeared to have suffered the worst damage, with several high-rises visibly burned or still burning. The freeways were choked with abandoned vehicles, Many crashed into each other in what must have been desperate attempts to flee. And everywhere, moving through streets and buildings, were the infected, thousands of them, far more than I'd imagined. Most disturbing was their movement pattern. From our elevated position, it was clear they weren't wandering randomly. They were flowing like water through the city, converging on key locations, primarily water infrastructure. A large concentration surrounded the municipal water tower several miles to the east. Others gathered at pumping stations, reservoir access points, and community wells. They were systematically targeting the water supply network. Even more concerning were the rivers and canals. The infected gathered along the banks, wading into the water whenever possible. Some didn't emerge again, and I wondered if they were transforming into something like what we'd encountered in the intake tunnel, entities that could move freely through water systems. "My God," Thomas whispered, taking in the devastating panorama. "It's everywhere." He was right. Whatever this infection was, it had completely overrun the city in less than 24 hours. But amid the chaos, I spotted something promising. A military perimeter established around the state fairgrounds, approximately 5 miles northeast of our position. Even from this distance, I could see the organized defensive layout, with barricades, checkpoints, and what appeared to be decontamination stations. Helicopters circled the area, occasionally landing to deliver supplies or evacuate people. The safe zone, I pointed it out to Thomas. It's still operational. This was our first piece of good news since the outbreak began. The military was maintaining control of at least one area, and the evacuation efforts were continuing. If we could reach that perimeter, we might find safety and an opportunity to share what we'd learned about the water-based infection. But 5 miles through infected-filled streets would be nearly impossible on foot. We needed transportation and a route that avoided the heaviest concentrations of infected. From our rooftop vantage point, I studied the city grid, looking for potential paths. The river district looks clearer, I noted, pointing to an area northeast of our position. Fewer infected visible there. If we can reach it, we might be able to follow the American River toward the fairgrounds. The river itself is probably dangerous, but the bike path along the levee might provide a relatively clear route. As I formulated this plan, a disturbing sound came from the secured hatch, a wet, persistent thumping. Keller was still trying to reach us. The rebar securing the hatch was holding for now, but the constant impacts were causing the metal to bend slightly with each hit. Given enough time, he would break through. "We should check what supplies we have left," Thomas suggested, eyeing the hatch nervously, "and look for anything useful up here before we try to leave." We inventoried our remaining tools and supplies, which had diminished considerably during our journey through the facility. We still had the fire axe, pipe wrench, and several smaller tools that could serve as weapons. The duffel bag contained my water filtration prototype, some emergency rations from the control room, and the water samples I'd collected from the generator room. Not much to sustain us on a 5-mile journey through an infected city. The roof itself provided a few additional resources. A maintenance shed contained extra tools, some lengths of rope, and a first aid kit that supplemented our dwindling medical supplies. Most valuable was a set of two-way radios with chargers, standard equipment for maintenance workers operating in different parts of the facility. The radios were battery-powered and would allow us to communicate if we became separated. "We should try to reach the evacuation zone before dark," I said, checking the sun's position. "That gives us about 4 hours." Getting down from the roof presented its own challenge. The ladder we'd used to access it was now too dangerous, with Keller waiting below. The fire escape on the building's east side was our best alternative, but reaching it would require crossing to the opposite end of the roof. As we gathered our supplies and prepared to leave, I noticed something strange happening at the water treatment facility below us. The infected were behaving differently than they had been earlier. Instead of randomly pounding on doors and windows, they were now working together with apparent purpose, focusing on specific access points and infrastructure components. Some were even using tools they'd acquired somewhere, attempting to open valves and control panels. "They're becoming more coordinated," I observed to Thomas. "More intelligent. Is that even possible? How could an infection make them smarter?" "I don't think it's making them smarter individually. I think they're becoming part of a network, sharing information and functioning as components of a larger system." The implication was terrifying. If the infected could adapt and coordinate this rapidly, outrunning them might soon become impossible. We needed to reach the military safe zone as quickly as possible, not just for our own survival, but to warn them about what we were witnessing. We made our way across the roof toward the fire escape, moving cautiously to avoid making noise that might attract more infected to the building. The persistent thumping from the secured hatch continued, growing slightly louder as the metal fatigued under repeated impacts. The fire escape was an older design, a metal staircase zigzagging down the building's exterior to a pull-down ladder that would allow final descent to the ground. It hadn't been maintained properly, with visible rust on many components, but it appeared structurally sound enough to support our weight. I went first, testing each section before committing my full weight. The metal creaked alarmingly but held. Thomas followed, his heavier frame causing even more concerning noises from the aging structure. We descended as quietly as possible, painfully aware that sound would attract the infected roaming the grounds below. 3 floors down, disaster struck. A section of railing, weakened by years of exposure, broke away as Thomas leaned against it. The metal clattered loudly as it fell to the ground below. We froze, listening for any reaction. Almost immediately, we heard them, the wet shuffling sounds of infected moving toward the noise. "We need to move faster," I urged, abandoning stealth for speed. We hurried down the remaining flights, the infected gathering at the base of the fire escape by the time we reached the final ladder. There were 5 of them, all in various stages of transformation. Some still looked mostly human, with just the characteristic gray skin and clouded eyes. Others showed more advanced changes, distended limbs, waterlogged features, visible dark veining beneath the skin. The final ladder was designed to remain retracted until pulled down for use, preventing unauthorized access to the building. It now hung just out of reach, about 15 feet above the gathered infected. We had no choice but to jump and hope we could fight our way clear. I went first again, dropping the supply bag ahead of me to free my hands for the pipe wrench. The landing was jarring but controlled. I immediately swung the wrench at the nearest infected, connecting solidly with its skull. The impact should have been devastating, but instead of dropping, the infected merely staggered back, black fluid leaking from the wound but quickly resealing itself. The temporary disorientation was enough for me to create space, backing away from the immediate cluster. Thomas landed behind me, fire axe already swinging in a wide arc that separated an infected's arm at the elbow. The limb fell to the ground, still moving independently like some grotesque insect. "The parking lot," I shouted to Thomas, pointing toward the employee parking area about 100 yards away. "We need transportation." We fought our way clear of the immediate threat, not trying to kill the infected but simply creating enough space to maneuver past them. Their coordination was improving visibly. Instead of individual attacks, they were attempting to hurt us, cutting off escape routes and forcing us toward the water treatment areas. The parking lot had largely emptied during the initial evacuation, but a few vehicles remained, mostly those belonging to night shift workers who had been trapped like us. My own car was among them, a blue sedan parked near the eastern exit. If the keys were still in my locker, and if we could reach it, we might have a means of covering the distance to the evacuation zone. "The locker room," I called to Thomas as we sprinted across the open ground. "We need to get my keys." The employee locker room was located in the administration building's ground floor, accessible through a side entrance near the parking area. We need to re-enter the facility we just escaped, but only briefly. The risk seemed worth the potential reward of motorized transportation. The side entrance required keycard access, which my card still provided despite the power restrictions. We slipped inside, immediately assaulted by the smell, a damp mineral odor overlaid with a distinct scent of decay. The corridor leading to the locker room appeared clear, the emergency lighting providing just enough illumination to navigate. We moved as quickly as stealth allowed, reaching the locker room without encountering resistance. The space was standard, rows of metal lockers lining the walls, benches down the center, shower stalls in the back. And it appeared empty, though the limited lighting created deep shadows between the locker rows. My locker was in the 3rd row, near the shower area. I hurried to it, dialing in my combination with fingers made clumsy by adrenaline. The lock clicked open, and I swung the door wide, immediately spotting my keys on the upper shelf where I'd left them the previous night. I grabbed them, along with a jacket that might provide some additional protection. As I closed the locker, Thomas hissed a warning. From the shower area came the sound of running water, a steady stream spilling onto the tiled floor. Someone had turned on the shower, or perhaps a pipe had burst. Either way, the water was flowing freely, creating a growing puddle that spread across the locker room floor. And in that puddle, I could see them, the same dark particles we'd observed in the water throughout the facility, moving with that same unnatural purpose. The infection was here, actively spreading through the locker room. We needed to leave immediately. "Don't touch the water," I warned Thomas, backing toward the exit. get to higher ground. We retreated to the benches, using them as stepping stones to avoid the expanding puddle. The water flow increased, as if responding to our presence. More showers activated automatically, despite the power restrictions that should have limited water pressure. The infection was actively manipulating the facility's systems now, using its understanding of the infrastructure against us. We reached the exit just as the puddle reached the door threshold. Outside, we sprinted for the parking lot, not bothering with stealth now that our presence was known. The infected on the grounds had increased in number, drawn by the commotion or perhaps summoned by whatever intelligence was coordinating them. My car was where I'd left it, though the windshield had been cracked by falling debris. I unlocked it remotely as we approached, both of us diving inside and immediately locking the doors behind us. Several infected reached the vehicle moments later, pounding on the windows and leaving wet, dark smears on the glass. The engine started on the first try, a small miracle given the circumstances. I reversed sharply, dislodging the infected clinging to the hood, then accelerated toward the exit gate. The security barrier was raised, another piece of luck. Perhaps the emergency protocols had automatically opened exits to facilitate evacuation. As we cleared the facility perimeter and turned onto the access road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The infected weren't pursuing us on foot. They seemed to recognize the futility of chasing a vehicle. Instead, they were returning to the facility, resuming their systematic infiltration of the water treatment systems. Whatever intelligence guided them understood priorities and resource allocation, focusing on the infrastructure that would allow the infection to spread most efficiently. "We made it," Thomas exhaled, the tension of the past hours evident in his voice. "I can't believe we actually made it out." But my relief was tempered by what I'd witnessed. The infected weren't just mindless zombies from horror movies. They were instruments of something far more intelligent and strategic, something that understood human infrastructure and was actively exploiting it. And we just abandoned the primary water treatment facility to its control. "We need to tell the military what we've seen," I said, navigating through streets littered with abandoned vehicles and debris. "The water supply for the entire region is compromised. If they don't understand what they're dealing with, the evacuation zone could be next." I chose a route that avoided the city center, where the highest concentration of infected had been visible from our rooftop vantage point. The residential areas to the northeast seemed less densely populated with infected, though we still encountered groups of them at intersections and gathered around neighborhood water features like decorative fountains and swimming pools. Their behavior confirmed my theory about water seeking. The infected were drawn to water sources, especially moving water. They would dip their hands and faces into any water they encountered, absorbing it through skin contact rather than drinking. Those that had been exposed to more water showed more advanced transformation, with some barely recognizable as human anymore. We drove in tense silence for several miles, avoiding the largest groups of infected by taking detours through side streets and alleyways. Occasionally we had to push abandoned vehicles out of our path, working quickly while watching for movement in all directions. The city had transformed into an obstacle course designed by Nightmare, with danger lurking around every corner. As we approached the river district, I noticed something unusual. The streets were almost entirely clear of infected, despite being closer to the American River, which should have drawn them in large numbers. Instead, the area appeared abandoned, with no movement visible in any direction. "Something's wrong," I said, slowing the car. "There should be more of them here, not fewer." Thomas scanned the surroundings nervously. "Maybe they've moved on to more concentrated water sources." But that didn't align with the behavior patterns we'd observed. The infected were drawn to all water sources, not just the largest ones. Their absence here suggested something else was happening, something potentially worse than their presence. I turned onto a street that would give us a view of the river, driving slowly and watching for any sign of threat. As we crested a small rise, the river came into view, and with it, the explanation for the abandoned streets. The infected hadn't left the area. They had converged on the river itself. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them lined the banks and waded in the water. But they weren't behaving like the infected we'd encountered before. They were changing, transforming into something else entirely. Those furthest into the water had lost all semblance of human form. Their bodies were dissolving, breaking down into the same dark filaments we'd seen in the water samples. As we watched, one fully submerged, its form dissipating like ink in water. But the resulting cloud didn't disperse. It maintained cohesion, moving with purpose through the river current. They're becoming part of it, I realized with horror. The infection isn't just controlling them, it's consuming them, using their biomass to grow. The water itself was changing visibly, darkening as more infected dissolved into it. The surface rippled with unnatural movement, forming temporary patterns that suggested organization and intelligence. Whatever had begun as microscopic particles in the water supply was now growing into something far larger and more complex, using human hosts as raw material. "We can't go near the river," I told Thomas, putting the car in reverse. "We need to find another route to the evacuation zone." As I backed away from the disturbing scene, movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. Something was emerging from a storm drain at the side of the road, not an infected person, but a writhing mass of dark filaments, similar to what we'd seen in the intake tunnel, but much larger. It was using the city's drainage system to extend its reach beyond the river. "Drive," Thomas urged, spotting the emerging threat. Now, I accelerated away from both the river and the storm drain, forced to recalculate our route yet again. The drainage system connected to everything: sewers, runoff channels, irrigation systems. If the infection had accessed that network, nowhere with water infrastructure would be truly safe. Our new path would take us further inland, away from the river but also away from the most direct route to the evacuation zone. It would add miles to our journey, but the alternative was facing whatever was emerging from the water system. "We're going to need to abandon the car eventually," I told Thomas as we navigated through residential streets. "The roads get too congested closer to the fairgrounds, according to what we saw from the roof. We'll have to proceed on foot for the final approach." Thomas nodded grimly, checking the supplies we'd salvaged. "How much farther do you think we can drive?" "Maybe another mile or two before the roads become impassable. Then we'll have at least 2 miles on foot. 2 miles through infected territory, with no guarantee the evacuation zone would still be accessible by the time we arrived. But we had no choice. Our knowledge about the water-based infection could save countless lives if we reached the military perimeter. As we drove, I thought about my water filtration prototype, still secured in our supply bag. It had been designed to remove contaminants far smaller than conventional filters could capture. If the infection consisted of the dark particles we'd observed, the prototype might effectively filter them out, providing safe drinking water even from contaminated sources. What had begun as a side project, ridiculed by colleagues, might now be one of humanity's few defenses against this new threat. I needed to reach the evacuation zone, not just for our own survival, but to share this technology with those who could implement it on a larger scale. We continued driving until, as predicted, the roads became too congested with abandoned vehicles to proceed further. We were approximately 2 miles from the fairgrounds perimeter, close enough to see military helicopters occasionally passing overhead. The sun was lowering in the sky. We had perhaps 2 hours of daylight remaining to cover the distance on foot. "This is as far as we go by car," I said, pulling into a clear area beside a small commercial building. "From here we walk." We gathered our supplies, prioritizing the water samples, filtration prototype, and weapons we'd acquired. The radio from the roof would allow us to potentially contact military frequencies as we got closer. Everything else was left behind, sacrificed for mobility. Before leaving the relative safety of the car, I studied our surroundings carefully. The area seemed less heavily populated with infected than other parts of the city, but they were still present, visible in small groups, gathered around a decorative fountain in a nearby plaza, and moving individually through side streets. "Stay alert, move quickly, and avoid water," I instructed Thomas. "We're in the final stretch now." As we stepped out of the vehicle, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by the infected wandering nearby, but by something else. Something that understood exactly what we were trying to do and was calculating how to stop us. We moved through the abandoned commercial district with practiced caution, keeping to the shadows and freezing at any sound. The infected in this area seemed more scattered than what we'd seen elsewhere, but their behavior was evolving. They moved with greater purpose now, less the shambling gait of classic zombies and more the deliberate movements of hunters. After about half a mile, we encountered our first major obstacle. The most direct route to the fairgrounds was blocked by a massive traffic pileup, where panicked drivers had collided while trying to flee the city. Dozens of vehicles were tangled together, creating an impassable barrier. Worse, the wreckage had ruptured a fire hydrant, creating a continuous spray of water that had attracted at least 20 infected. They clustered around the spray, faces upturned to catch the water, their skin showing various stages of the transformation process we'd witnessed at the river. Some already displayed the advanced signs: dark veining visible beneath gray skin, eyes completely black, movements unnaturally fluid. They were absorbing the water directly through their skin, using it to fuel their transformation. "We need to go around," I whispered to Thomas, indicating a side street that would take us on a detour through a residential neighborhood. The detour added precious time to our journey, but attempting to push through the infected cluster would have been suicide. As we navigated through the residential streets, I noticed something disturbing. The lawns and gardens were unnaturally wet, as if recently saturated despite the dry weather we'd been experiencing. Puddles had formed in unlikely places, collecting in depressions on sidewalks and driveways. "It's manipulating the water table," I realized, forcing groundwater to the surface. The infection wasn't just spreading through existing water sources. It was creating new ones, saturating the environment to facilitate its growth. The implications were terrifying. If it could control water at this level, nowhere would remain dry for long. We quickened our pace, avoiding the suspicious puddles and damp areas. The military safe zone was now visible in the distance, a collection of temporary structures surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. Floodlights were being set up as the afternoon waned, creating a beacon of organized human resistance amid the chaos of the fallen city. As we approached the 1-mile mark from the perimeter, we encountered something unexpected: other survivors. A small group of civilians was holed up in a gas station mini-mart, using shopping carts and shelving to barricade the entrances. They spotted us through the windows, and after some hesitation, moved some of the barricades to let us in. There were 7 of them, 3 men, 2 women, and 2 children. They looked exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified. When they saw our relatively organized appearance and the weapons we carried, hope flickered in their eyes. "Are you military?" asked an older man who seemed to be the group's leader. His name was Wilson, he explained, a retired schoolteacher who had been gathering supplies when the outbreak hit. "No," I replied. "I'm Everett, chief water engineer from the municipal treatment plant. This is Thomas, maintenance supervisor. We've been trying to reach the evacuation zone since yesterday." The group had been trapped in the mini-mart for nearly 12 hours, they explained. They'd been part of a larger group attempting to reach the military perimeter, but had been separated when infected swarmed their position. The mini-mart had been a desperate last stand, but their situation was deteriorating. They had little food and, critically, were nearly out of water. "We're afraid to drink from the taps," Wilson explained. "Early reports said something was in the water. Is that true?" I hesitated, weighing how much to share versus the panic it might cause. But these people deserved the truth, especially since their lives depended on making informed decisions about water consumption. "Yes," I confirmed. "The infection is waterborne. It started in the municipal supply, but it's spreading to all water sources now. Drinking contaminated water is the primary infection vector, though bites can also transmit it." I explained what we'd witnessed at the treatment plant and during our journey: the water-seeking behavior of the infected, their transformation when exposed to more contaminated water, and the intelligent coordination they were exhibiting. The survivors listened with growing horror. "So we can't drink any water?" one of the women asked, cradling a young boy who showed signs of dehydration. "We'll die without it." This was where my prototype might prove valuable. I removed it from my pack and showed it to the group. "This is an experimental filtration system I've been developing," I explained. "It uses a multi-stage approach with components that can filter particles much smaller than conventional systems. It might be effective against the infection." Hope rekindled in their eyes, though tempered with skepticism. The woman with the child, Sarah was her name, looked particularly desperate. "My son needs water," she said simply. "We'll try anything." We tested the prototype on a bottle of tap water from the mini-mart bathroom. I activated the filtration process, explaining how each component worked as the group watched intently. After several minutes, the water passed through the final stage, looking clearer than before. But appearances meant nothing with this infection. The particles we'd observed were microscopic, undetectable by visual inspection alone. Without laboratory equipment, we couldn't be certain the water was safe. "I'll try it first," I decided. Someone had to take the risk, and as the designer of the system, it should be me. The group watched tensely as I took a small sip of the filtered water. It tasted normal, clean with a slight mineral quality, typical of Sacramento municipal water. But the true test would come with time. If the filtration had failed, I would begin showing symptoms within hours, according to the progression we'd observed in Pete. "We should wait before anyone else drinks it," I advised the group. "If I'm still normal in a few hours, then it's probably safe." This created a new dilemma. The children especially needed water soon, but risking infection was potentially worse than dehydration. We agreed to wait 1 hour, monitoring my condition closely, before making further decisions. During that hour, I discussed our situation with Wilson and the other adults. The evacuation zone was still accepting survivors, but the process had become more stringent. Military personnel were implementing stringent decontamination procedures and medical screening before allowing anyone inside the perimeter. They're scanning everyone with some kind of handheld device, Wilson explained. Anyone who shows signs of infection is quarantined in a separate area. No one has seen those people again. The military had clearly identified the infection's waterborne nature and was taking appropriate precautions. This was encouraging. It meant they were developing an understanding of what they were dealing with. If we could reach them with our first-hand knowledge and the water samples we'd collected, it might accelerate their response efforts. After an hour had passed with no symptoms manifesting, we decided to allow the most dehydrated survivors, the children and an elderly man, to drink small amounts of the filtered water. I demonstrated how to operate the prototype so they could produce more as needed. We need to reach the evacuation zone before dark, I told the group. The infected seemed to become more active at night, and the military might restrict entry after sunset for security reasons. Wilson and the others were eager to join us. They've been paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, trapped in their temporary shelter without a plan. Our arrival had provided direction and the most valuable resource in this crisis, knowledge about what they were facing. We gathered what supplies remained in the mini-mart, focusing on non-perishable food and anything that might serve as a weapon. The group had a shopping cart that could transport their supplies and help the elderly man who had difficulty walking. It wasn't ideal for speed or stealth, but abandoning the vulnerable members wasn't an option. Before leaving, I tried the radio we'd salvaged from the treatment plant roof, scanning for military frequencies. After several attempts, we received a response, a terse acknowledgement and instructions to provide our location and number of survivors. 9 survivors at the Gas and Go On Exposition Boulevard, I reported, approximately 1 mile southwest of the perimeter. We have critical information about the infection's water-based transmission vector. The mention of information about the infection prompted a more detailed response. We were instructed to proceed to Checkpoint Bravo on the southwestern edge of the fairgrounds, where a team would be waiting specifically for us. The transmission included warning about increased infected activity in several areas between our position and the checkpoint, advising us to avoid Exposition Center Drive due to a major concentration. With this intelligence, we planned our final approach. The most direct route would take us through a residential area, then across a large parking lot to reach the checkpoint. If we moved quickly and avoided attracting attention, we might make it before sunset. We left the mini-mart in a tight formation, with Thomas and I taking point and rear positions, while the others clustered in the middle around the shopping cart. Progress was slower than I'd hoped, the cart's wheels catching on debris and creating more noise than was safe. But we had no alternative if we wanted to bring everyone. The residential area was eerily quiet, the manicured lawns and suburban homes standing in stark contrast to the catastrophe unfolding around them. Many houses showed signs of hasty evacuation, doors left open, personal belongings scattered on driveways, occasionally a crashed car in a front yard or against a tree. But we saw few infected, which was both a relief and concerning. Their absence suggested they might be congregating elsewhere for some purpose. Our first encounter came at an intersection where a water main had broken, creating a sinkhole filled with muddy water. 3 infected were partially submerged in the pool, their bodies undergoing the now familiar transformation. They were in an advanced state, their limbs elongated and distorted, skin translucent enough to reveal the dark network spreading beneath the surface. We backtracked and detoured around the block, adding precious minutes to our journey as the sun continued to lower. The delay proved costly. As we rounded the corner back onto our planned route, we encountered a larger group of infected, at least 15 of them, moving with that coordinated purpose we'd observed in the later stages. There was no time to retreat. They'd already spotted us, their black eyes fixing on our group with predatory focus. We had to fight through. Get behind us, I instructed the civilians, readying my pipe wrench. Thomas raised his fire axe, and Wilson produced a baseball bat he'd found in the mini-mart. The infected charged with unsettling coordination. Not the mindless rush we'd seen earlier, but a tactical approach, attempting to flank and surround us. We engaged them at the narrowest point of the street, using a parked car as a choke point to limit how many could approach at once. The combat was desperate and chaotic. I swung the pipe wrench with all my strength, connecting with an infected skull. Unlike our earlier encounters, this one dropped immediately, black fluid leaking from the wound. They were becoming more dangerous but also more physically vulnerable as the transformation progressed, sacrificing structural integrity for greater coordination. Thomas proved remarkably effective with the fire axe, his powerful swings separating limbs and creating space for our group to advance. Wilson, despite his age, used the baseball bat with the practiced skill of a former athlete, keeping the infected at bay on our left flank. We fought our way through, the civilians helping by pushing the shopping cart into approaching infected, creating temporary barriers. But we took casualties. One of the men, a younger guy named Marcus, was grabbed by an infected that had circled around a car. The bite took a chunk from his forearm before Thomas could dispatch the attacker. We pulled Marcus free and continued moving, knowing there was no time to address the wound properly. The infection had been transmitted. He would begin turning within hours based on what we'd seen with Jenkins. But we couldn't abandon him, not when the military might have developed treatments or containment protocols. The skirmish had cost us time and attracted more attention. As we approached a large parking lot that separated us from the checkpoint, I could see more infected converging on our position, drawn by the sounds of combat and perhaps by some awareness that we were carrying water, the filtered supply in our prototype. The parking lot presented a new challenge, open ground with little cover, at least 300 yards to cross before reaching the military checkpoint visible on the far side. Concrete barriers and guard posts marked the perimeter, with armed soldiers visible even from this distance, so close, yet with a gauntlet of danger between us and safety. We need to move fast, I told the group. No stopping, no matter what happens. Head straight for the checkpoint. We entered the parking lot at a jog, the fastest pace the elderly man and children could maintain. The shopping cart rattled loudly over the uneven pavement, creating a beacon of sound that drew infected from multiple directions. They emerged from between abandoned cars and from inside the expo center buildings to our right, their numbers growing alarming. Halfway across, disaster struck. The shopping cart's wheel caught in a drainage grate, stopping it abruptly. The elderly man stumbled and fell, crying out in pain as his knee twisted beneath him. Sarah and the other woman tried to help him up, while the remaining man attempted to free the cart. "Leave it," I shouted, seeing the infected closing in. "Just carry what you can and go." They abandoned the cart, Wilson and Thomas, helping the injured man while the others grabbed essential supplies, including my prototype filter. We resumed our desperate dash toward the checkpoint, the infected now just 50 yards behind us and gaining. The soldiers at the checkpoint had spotted our approach and the danger pursuing us. They shouted instructions to each other, several taking up firing positions while others prepared to open a gap in the concrete barriers. A spotlight activated, illuminating our path as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Move to the left of the barrier," a voice boomed through a megaphone. Single file, hands visible. We adjusted our course as instructed, the military precision, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past 36 hours. The gap in the barriers appeared as panels were shifted by hydraulic systems, creating a narrow corridor that would allow us through while being easily sealed against the infected. The final 50 yards were a sprint, the infected closing the distance with each step. I could hear their wet footfalls behind us, almost feel their outstretched hands reaching for us. Marcus stumbled, the infection progressing faster than expected, his movements becoming uncoordinated. Thomas and Wilson grabbed him under the arms, practically dragging him the remaining distance. We reached the corridor, soldiers ushering us through with urgent gestures. I was the last one through, turning to see the first infected just yards away. The barriers slammed shut behind me, cutting off their pursuit with a finality that left me weak-kneed with relief. But we weren't safe yet. The military had established decontamination protocols that all survivors had to undergo before entering the main safe zone. We were directed into a series of tents where personnel in hazmat suits waited with scanning equipment and decontamination showers. Water-based contagion protocols in effect, announced a soldier, separating us into individual processing lanes. No physical contact. All personal items will be confiscated for decontamination or disposal. I try to explain about the water samples and filtration prototype, their crucial importance for understanding the infection, but the processing was rigidly systematic. Everything was bagged and tagged, with assurances that scientific personnel would examine all items of potential value. The decontamination process was thorough and impersonal. We were instructed to remove all clothing, then proceeded through a series of chemical showers designed to eliminate any waterborne contaminants. The water itself came from sealed military tankers, presumably transported from unaffected regions and thoroughly treated. Marcus was identified immediately by the scanning equipment, which detected the infection spreading through his system. He was separated from our group and taken to what they called specialized containment, though the grim expressions of the personnel suggested treatment options were limited or non-existent. The rest of us cleared the screening, though the soldiers marked Thomas and me for additional medical observation due to our prolonged exposure at the water treatment facility. After decontamination, we were provided with military-issue clothing and directed to a processing center where officials recorded our information and experiences. This was my opportunity to share what we'd learned. I described everything we witnessed: the initial water quality anomalies, Pete's transformation, the increasingly coordinated behavior of the infected, and the advanced forms we'd encountered in the intake tunnel and at the river. Most importantly, I detailed the apparent intelligence guiding the infection's spread, its systematic targeting of water infrastructure, and its ability to manipulate hosts to further its transmission. The military intelligence officer interviewing me listened intently, occasionally consulting with scientific personnel as I explained the technical aspects of water treatment and distribution systems. When I mentioned my filtration prototype and the successful test at the Minimart, their interest intensified. "We've observed similar patterns," the officer confirmed after I finished. "The infection appears to be a synthetic biological agent designed specifically to compromise water supplies. Your first-hand observations from the treatment plant are invaluable, particularly regarding its adaptive capabilities. They reveal that similar outbreaks had occurred simultaneously in major cities across the country, all following the same pattern: initial infection through municipal water supplies, followed by rapid spread and systematic targeting of water infrastructure. The military had established containment zones like this, one in each affected region, but they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that used the most essential human resource as its vector. Your filtration system could be critical," the officer explained. "Our current purification methods are only partially effective. If your prototype works as described, it could be replicated for wider distribution." I was introduced to a team of military scientists who had been working on countermeasures against the infection. They had already determined its artificial nature. The organism showed clear signs of bioengineering, with characteristics impossible in naturally evolved pathogens. Its ability to coordinate infected hosts suggested some form of distributed intelligence, using human neural tissue as processing nodes in an expanding network. The scientists shared their most disturbing finding: the infection appeared designed not just to spread, but to systematically transform Earth's water cycle. By converting infected hosts into carriers that returned to water sources, it was gradually altering the chemical and biological composition of all connected water systems. The end goal seemed to be terraforming, changing Earth's environment to suit whatever had engineered this agent. "We believe it's the first stage of an invasion," one scientist explained grimly. "Not with ships or soldiers, but by changing our planet at its most fundamental level, its water." The military had established protocols for safe water handling and distribution within the evacuation zone. All water was transported in sealed containers from verified clean sources, treated multiple times before use, and strictly rationed. But supplies were finite, and as the infection spread to more watersheds, finding uncontaminated sources was becoming increasingly difficult. My prototype filtration system was immediately taken for analysis and testing against samples of infected water. If it proved effective, the military planned to implement the design on a larger scale, potentially creating community-sized filtration systems for the evacuation zones. Thomas and I were assigned quarters in the civilian section of the safe zone, converted exhibition halls filled with cots and basic amenities. The fairgrounds had been transformed into a small city, with military personnel, medical facilities, and thousands of survivors coexisting in an atmosphere of tense organization. That night, as I lay on my assigned cot surrounded by the sounds of 1,000 displaced people, I reflected on how quickly everything had changed. 48 hours earlier, I had been a water engineer concerned with the levels and bacterial counts. Now I was a survivor of humanity's first contact with something that wanted to remake our world in its image, using the very substance that gave us life. The military scientists had asked me to join their team, to help develop water purification systems that might give humanity a fighting chance. I had agreed without hesitation. My knowledge of water infrastructure and filtration technology was suddenly among the most valuable skills on the planet. In the coming days, I would learn that Sacramento was just one battleground in a global crisis. Similar outbreaks had occurred on every continent, all following the same pattern. The infection moved through connected water systems, jumping from city to city, river to river, gradually spreading across the planet. Humanity was organizing its response, establishing safe zones and developing countermeasures. But we were fighting an enemy that used our most fundamental need against us, that could hide in a drop of water, that could turn our own bodies into vessels for its spread. An enemy with patience and apparent intelligence, willing to transform its hosts through progressive stages to achieve its long-term goal. I share this account now as both warning and instruction. The water filtration techniques we've developed since those first 48 hours have proven effective against the initial stage of the infection. The prototype I designed has been improved and mass-produced, becoming a crucial tool in humanity's survival kit. But the infection is adapting, evolving new forms that challenge our countermeasures. What I witnessed at the Sacramento water treatment plant was just the beginning of a war for our planet's hydrosphere. A war fought not with conventional weapons, but with filtration systems, chemical treatments, and careful management of the resource we cannot live without. If you're watching this and still have access to uncontaminated water sources, guard them with your life. Learn the signs of infection: water with unusual movement patterns, dark particulates that avoid light, unexplained increases in water pressure or flow. Trust no water source without proper filtration, no matter how clean it appears. And remember what I learned in those first crucial hours. This isn't just a disease. It's intelligent, patient, and purposeful. It uses our infrastructure, our bodies, and our need for water to advance its goal of planetary transformation. Our only advantage is knowledge, understanding what we're fighting and how it spreads. The battle for Earth will be won or lost through water. As someone who spent my career making water safe for human consumption, I never imagined that role would place me on the front lines of humanity's most existential threat. But here we are, fighting for control of the substance that gives us life, against an enemy that would use it to remake our world into something unrecognizable. The water you save, filter, and protect today might be the resource that saves your community tomorrow. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and above all, stay human. That's what separates us from the networked intelligence that's trying to claim our planet, drop by drop.